So today, my name is Mandy Nolan. I am your chair today. Seems like a weird thing to say, but I am your chair. And today we're having a conversation. You would have said in your program, it's called The Earlier the Better. It's intervention strategies for children's mental health. And now when we talk about mental health, very often the frame is around concepts around, it's always around the adult experience. And very often we're not prepared for how to deal with or how to have conversations around mental health when it comes to dealing with children and adolescents. Today we have, and I'd like to actually choose one of Edwina's metaphors that when you have a young person who is experiencing mental unwellness, you very much do feel like you're adrift on a raft. I love that metaphor. Well, it was actually something happening in the book, but as a matter of not really knowing where you're going. I'm a mother of 5 children myself. I'm a comedian, but I had a very, it doesn't mean my life's very funny. In fact, for a long period of time, a huge part of it wasn't when my eldest daughter, who at 13 to probably 17 experienced pretty full-on mental illness with, anorexia, suicidality, self-harming, and there's nothing quite prepares you for the day when you put your child into a psychiatric institution and drive away. That's just not in the little blue book that the government gives out with the milestones. It's a very profoundly alone, terrifying time full of feelings of failure, and one of the hard things is how do we talk about this? How do we give these conversations to our community, and how do we have these conversations with our children? All 3 authors today, which I'm about to introduce, have written some really spectacular books around the subject. And very different. What's great is that it's very different in the style in which each of you has written to express and to have this conversation from fiction to narrative to and from young adult fiction to adult fiction to a fiction for children and to memoir. So it's a really diverse form of writing, and so much is in there. So we'll just start here with Edwina. Edwina Shaw we went to university together actually. I haven't seen her for 30 years except before. We haven't aged a bit.
Exactly the same.
Edwina Shaw is from Brisbane. Her novel Thrill Seekers is based on her brother Matthew's battle with adolescent onset schizophrenia, which began when he was 15 and resulted in his suicide at 20. Since then, she's been passionate about exploring the workings of the mind through fiction and in writing as a tool for healing. She's a special needs teacher and has worked in special schools and juvenile justice centres, established English schools in Cambodia, run programs for refugees, and currently teaches writing at University of Queensland. She's also an experienced yoga teacher and runs workshops and retreats, combining both. What a woman. Wow. Put your hands together for Edwina. Peter Carnavas writes and illustrates books for children and grown-ups and the grown-ups in their lives. He's created over 20 books, and last year he released his first novel, The Elephant, about a girl who tries to cheer up her father by chasing away an elephant that nobody else can see. The Elephant has been shortlisted for 4 national awards, including the CBCA Book of the Year for young readers. Peter lives on the Sunshine Coast hinterland with his wife and 2 daughters, a dog called Florence, and apparently a cat named Harry, and he says he's still getting used to the cat. So please welcome Peter. And Amanda Webster, on the end, also a fellow, I'm from Mullumbimby, and sometimes from Mullumbimby, is the author of The Boy Who Loved Apples, which was released internationally and also by Reader's Digest. She's a mother and former doctor. She's passionate about removing the stigma from mental illness, reading almost anything and regenerating rainforest on her property near Mullumbimby in New South Wales, where she regularly retreats to a hermit-like existence. She loves dark chocolate and blue skies, and there's a special place in her heart for Cocker Spaniels. Her most recent book is A Tear in the Soul, a story of a personal reconciliation with members of stolen generations she grew up with in Kalgoorlie. So please welcome Amanda. Did I get that right? Is that a tear in the soul?
No, it's a tear in the soul. But the publisher said the ambiguity was good.
It is. It's really lovely. Because I went, I wonder if I got that right. So I suppose just to start, before we actually touch on each of your books sort of more individually as part of the conversation at times, I'd be interested for anyone to start with sort of why, I guess, your personal experience a little bit, and what made you take that step into taking something as personal and often so sometimes quite traumatising into the arena of fiction or memoir and actually a narrative of telling your story. What was it for you? Do you want to start, Edwina?
Yeah. So these were the stories I couldn't get out of my head that had to be told so I could sleep. And so I started writing them. I didn't realise what it was. I just started writing. I went to a workshop, and one of the topics was write a story about something you're ashamed of. And a story out of that formed the basis of Thrill Seekers. Then I did my master's, and it all sort of came together. And because my brother's battle with schizophrenia was a very traumatic experience, but I think that by writing through that trauma, by making something beautiful from the pain, it can go a long way to healing you. And as I was just telling my workshop people, I don't have those stories in my head anymore. In fact, I've done so many drafts of this story, and it's fictionalised as well, autobiographical fiction. Can't even really remember what's the truth anymore.
Oh.
I have to go and check up because, yes, I've fiddled with the little bits and pieces here and there and changed little bits. Some bits are almost completely memoir, and other bits are made up. Informed by like the boys that I worked with in the Juvenile Justice Centre. Their stories got mixed in as well. And of course I've had my own mental health issues I was already in deep trouble before he died. So I was a self-harmer as well. I suffered anxiety and depression. And my own son, like you, it goes in families too, I think, the intergenerational trauma. Luckily, he's okay. And I've been able to help him by keeping that communication open. So I'm very interested to share some of what I learned with you. But yes, don't be afraid of writing about your stories. Get them out of your head onto the page.
That's true. It's kind of like almost like an exorcism, isn't it? Of actually getting is it like that? Because I imagine with a lot of the stories, particularly when you're dealing with children and the vulnerable, is you would internalise and hide a lot of that story. Was it like that? Was it like that for you, Amanda? Like getting it out? Because you were saying today you had to read the book again on the plane to try and remember.
I should apologise to you. I've got a bit of a cold, so forgive my voice. I don't think I really felt like I internalised a lot of things at the time. I felt like I was kind of leaking misery everywhere. It was probably more the situation for me. I was pretty much on a mission at the time. I'd encountered a lot of uninformed viewpoints in the health professionals that I interacted with during my son's illness. A lot of general misconceptions about anorexia, particularly that it's a disease about, it's about controlling your life, when in fact the illness controls the sufferer. And so I wanted to, I'd done a lot of research while my son was sick, and I wanted to pass on what I'd learnt. I'd also received a lot from reading other people's stories when my son was sick. And in fact, reading other stories was what ultimately led me to a treatment centre which, while not perfect, did help in the process of curing my son. So I felt like I had a need to give back to the community with our story. I did not write it with the intention of healing myself, but of course that ultimately did turn out to be partly the case. It was a little cathartic, the old C word. Would I write it again? That's a harder question to answer. There's a lot of my son in that story, and he was at an age where, it's a memoir, it's not fictionalised at all. He was at an age where informed consent is a dubious kind of concept, in his teen years. So about that I'm unsure.
Yeah, and I was going to ask about that too, because that's that real issue when you're writing memoir, and you're writing about a vulnerable person, the line is so blurred between your story and his story.
Absolutely.
Not even just blurred. If it's a Venn diagram, it's a circle within the circle, whatever that one was called, the subset or something. But it's so. Has that come back? Is that something you've had to reconcile later with him, or is that something? How have you made peace with that part? Because that, for me, that's one of my challenges as well.
Yeah. I wouldn't say that I have completely made peace with it. Anorexia is not something my son and I discuss a lot. There was a period in his early adulthood, a window opened where he wanted to talk to me about it, but it's such an intensely painful part of our lives, that period when he was sick, and he just wants to put it behind him. So it's not something that we actively talk about at the moment.
Do you think, sorry, Peter, and do jump in at this point, but I mean, it's also in writing, and even for you about, maybe just before I move on to shame, which will be my next sort of topic, because I feel like that's, very often, these stories are very heavily coded and wrapped in shame. So Peter, what was it that sort of drew you to writing about depression for children?
It was never my intention. It's something that happened. I had two characters in my head for a long time, which was a young girl about 8 years old and her grandfather. And for me, the crux of The Elephant is that relationship. They have a beautiful relationship, but they have a beautiful relationship because of the father's sadness in between. So I never set out to write a story about depression for kids. I think if I did that, I would hope somebody would stop me straight away, because I think that's way too self-important to think, I'm going to write about this for children. But it just kind of turned out to be that. And the depression is never mentioned in the story.
You never say it, that's why it's that, it's
yeah,
like magic realism.
I talk about his sadness,
and
his sadness is this imaginary elephant that follows him around. So it didn't really come from anything too personal. I found it quite easy to write those scenes where the father is sad. I think
Had you experienced it yourself? Was this something you'd experienced in your own life as a child or as the father?
No, I've never been diagnosed with anything, but...
You don't need to be.
Of course, but...
Isn't everybody?
You could be sad without a diagnosis.
Well, I guess that's how I think about it. My default setting is a little sort of towards sadness than joy. But... yeah, for me it was just trying to find... once I decided I was going to have that character, the father that had depression, it was just trying to find a way that would make sense and that would not be speaking down to children, but something they could make sense of. So that's why I made it something heavy and that doesn't go away.
That's what I particularly enjoyed about your book, Peter, having so many children myself and reading so many children's books, is that very often you do feel like books patronise children's intelligence and underestimates their ability to comprehend more complex ideas. And very often children are living in situations of domestic violence, of relationship and marital separation, of a parent's going through some experience of not feeling mentally sort of at the peak in that sense. And you did make the sadness quite beautiful. Like an elephant is a really it's a beautiful creature to have. There's something...
That's something I'm a little bit obsessed with in art and writing, is the beauty in sadness. So it didn't come from a personal place necessarily, but I'm drawn to music and I'm drawn to books that explore the beauty in sadness. And I don't know if there's actually I haven't come across the one word in English that...
Oh no, there is one.
What is it?
That's melancholy. That to me, that is the most beautiful. I think that's quite. It's quite a deep and beautiful sadness. Sometimes you have it at 3 o'clock in the morning. Do you ever have that? To wake up and have your little melancholy?
Or like in the Finn Family Moomintroll books. Have you read them?
No, I haven't.
By Tove Jansson. She is an expert in that sweet melancholy. I call it sweet melancholy. There's a sweetness about it as well.
Oh, it's gorgeous.
Yeah.
It is. So I did want to come back and talk about shame, and particularly when we're looking at early intervention for children, shame is very, very powerful. I suppose it's a powerful emotion that shapes so many of us, especially around trauma. How did you navigate shame in your writing or in your experience?
The first thing that popped into my head was when my son, who developed severe anxiety and OCD when he was about 12, and going to visit the psychiatrist, the government psychiatrist. We got in very quickly because my brother had a history of serious mental illness. And sitting in that waiting room, and everybody, all the parents, we were all there like being busy and, oh, you know, look, we're very, you know, we've got jobs, we're good parents. And somebody actually said, you know, nothing wrong with my parenting. And that's what you feel, because it's like, you know, you can't help but feel, uh-oh, you know.
Well, yeah, the fingers are, but you don't just feel it. It's in the pathologising, isn't it, Amanda? That I know it. I felt it when I was in the psychiatrist. I could feel people ticking boxes like controlling mother. And when I read Amanda's book, apparently there is a box that says controlling mother. Oh, is there?
Uh-oh.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, one of the early interviews I had with a psychologist, that was with Richie, my son, and within about 10 minutes of me being in the guy's room, he was saying to me, do you think you're triangulating with your husband and your son? And I mean, there it was, straight away, with knowing me 10 minutes, knowing 10 minutes worth of our life history, and he's saying that I'm triangulating with my husband and my son, and therefore...
Do you want to tell them what triangulating means?
kind of,
Because you're a doctor, so you know what. Some of us have been triangulating for years and we don't even know.
I'm, you know, apparently one of those mothers who, instead of allowing her children to have a direct relationship with their father, I have to interfere and sort of be in on the reaction. So it, you know, it literally goes around in a triangle, never straight between father and son. And it wasn't the case at all. And I mean, even if it was, that man couldn't possibly have known that within 10 minutes of us sitting in that room.
Well, you can't know. And there's also that assumption, isn't it, that very often we triangulate. That's quite a patriarchal assumption too.
Well, the mother was always blamed. My mother was blamed.
Was she?
Yes.
Yeah.
And she, you know, you don't need another burden.
No, you don't. But blaming doesn't actually even help. Even if it was your fault, you can't go back.
Yes.
You know, my first husband was domestic violence. He was a heroin addict. I lived in, and it's not a surprise. My eldest daughter ended up with a mental health issue because she'd lived through trauma. It really was, in a sense, my fault. Not like that. I put her in that situation. But going back and, you know, you can't retrace those steps. I couldn't take it. All you can do is move forward. You can't shame people into feeling like bad parents.
I think it's also important to remember too that there's no, you know, absolutely direct correlation between any one event and a mental illness. So other children in a similar situation might have had a very different response. So in that sense, you know, no blame there at all. You know, it's.
Do you think there's also, I mean, what misconceptions for you, for any of you, around mental health, particularly because we're talking about children here, kind of gets in the way of accessing help or actually realising what's happening at the time? Because I know, you know, very often there's that concept of, oh, that's just a naughty child. Oh, that child's just acting out. Oh, that child just wants attention. You know that thing of that child's attention seeking. Where do we learn to stop, to draw that line and go, no, this is more, this is something, like when, you know, do you something that you intuitively know that this requires something more?
When your child is in pain, you know, don't you? You know.
Yeah. But I was just asking the question.
Yes, and you know, you that's the last thing you want. And for me, it set off all my buttons because of my brother's mental illness. It was like, oh, shit, that's a bad trajectory we're looking at, because Matty had killed himself at 20. And my son was starting to have paranoid delusions and stuff, and he was only 12, and so I knew I needed to get help straight away. And luckily I got him in there it was a government-sponsored program, so it was free. We had weekly, even twice a week visits at the start, and just with behavioural cognitive therapy, plus I used, he'd had shingles as well, which I think really aggravated his nervous system. We're a highly strung family, very sensitive, which is great for writing, not so great for navigating the world. So I used vitamins and herbs, you know, I'm a bit of a hippie. And acupuncture really helped. He would say no, he won't even take, you know, zinc or anything now, but anyway. it worked. I think it really helped, and the behavioural cognitive therapy, and just a lot of, it was actually being there. You know, I think it's so important to spend that time. Don't, you know, whatever you can do, pull back from work requirements and be there.
I actually had a really hard time coming to terms with the fact that Richie did have anorexia. It took me a long time to recognise it. And
Amanda, how old was he when
he was about 11 and a half.
Right.
So there was that factor, the fact that he was so young. I didn't, this was back in 2002, I didn't realise that such young children could get anorexia. But in fact, Westmead Hospital and the Royal Children's in Melbourne both report greatly increased numbers of children under the age of 12 being admitted with eating disorders since the year 2000. Didn't know it at the time, even though I was a doctor. And of course the other thing was that he's a boy, and you know, who knew boys could get anorexia? But as it turns out, about 25 to 30% of young sufferers, slightly higher in the pre-pubertal age group, are male. And the overall lifetime numbers are probably fairly close of eating disorders, probably fairly close between women and men. But, you know, I just didn't know that. Then the other big problem for me was that eating disorders kind of, in many cases, particularly where there are very pronounced obsessive symptoms, they kind of infiltrate your entire life. So Richie had always loved animals, and when he wanted to become a vegetarian because he was worried about cruelty towards animals, I was like, oh, that's so sweet. And, you know, no, it wasn't too sweet. It was actually the first step towards an eating, you know, it was the first step in an eating disorder, really. There were, and all their walking up and down our rainforest track, you know, well, that's lovely. He's out there enjoying nature. But he was also burning a lot of energy.
But you could only see that looking back.
Exactly.
That's that thing of...
It was insidious.
It's the bias of history, is that when you see the steps coming out, when you look back, you go, oh,
it was obvious.
It was obvious, but only when you saw later the result. When did you know? When did you draw a line and go, I think, you know, because they're all things a child could be doing, which were not related to developing a serious mental health issue.
Yeah. I think the absolute final straw for me was when he stopped eating all his apples. And we'd long had this little ritual where he'd have 2 apples before bed, and he liked them done exactly the same way. I'd been doing it for years. You know, peel the apple, cut it up into 8 pieces, and it was like a highlight of his day. And he started leaving little bits of apple and half an apple, and you know, I actually really that told me something was wrong, because he'd never ever done that before. But instead of galvanising me into action, what it did was absolutely paralyse me with fear, because coming from a medical background, I'd come up through a system where treatment of anorexia was really punitive. It was always hospitalisation, and it was you gain weight to earn privileges. And privileges were basic human rights, like a shower, being able to go to the toilet, having a book to read, having visits from family and friends. And there was no way I wanted my son to be punished for what I knew was something that was completely not his fault. You know, when you're the mother of the child and you've seen the illness evolve over a period of time, you can't help but know that there's nothing deliberate about it, there's no choice involved, that your child is actually completely controlled by the illness.
And that, you know, I mean, how do you account then, I mean, I guess living regionally, which was what my experience was too. I mean, I remember thinking when my daughter, at 12, she developed her eating disorder. Developed. Eventually, by 15, she couldn't walk up the stairs at school, so she, you know, we had to take her out. And I thought, I left it go for a little bit of time because I thought it was normal. And I was saying before, I've seen the ads on television, you know, all that, call this number, this will happen. I've read the stories. I went, there must be so much help out there if, you know, because I know that I've read about eating disorders and how common they are, and they have the highest mortality. I don't know if anyone knows that, of any mental health issue. I went, doctors must be all across this. There must be stuff. And I was absolutely blown away by the fact that I found nothing. which was your...
Very much my experience, and I think that's probably true of most rural areas in Australia. Part of it's a population problem. I mean, in the US, the population's so enormous that eating disorders are a real subspecialty of psychiatry and probably also psychology as well. But that's not nearly so much the case in Australia. The other problem was, though, that back when Richie was sick, and I think it's less of a problem now, but maybe still a problem in some areas, the knowledge about the only evidence-based treatment of anorexia in younger age people really was not available in Australia. I mean, this is early internet days too, well, early internet days for me. So, and it's a really smart therapy to use in country areas because it's all about giving the charge of treating the child back to the parent, coaching them how to get the child through a meal, because it's on the assumption that parents basically have the skills to feed their child. They just need support and, maybe a little bit of encouragement and some extra knowledge about how to increase calorie intake in a meal. But that information just wasn't available back in those days.
Do you think sometimes one of the barriers to treatment for young people with mental health issues is the fear of the hardship of the treatment itself? Was that, I don't know, like the fact of being hospitalised or being...
Did you get to keep him out of hospital?
I did, but I had to run away from a few psychiatrists in the process. and I probably did risk my son's life a little, though, if push comes to shove, I would have been dialing 000. But it was definitely a risk, not something I'd recommend. But I kept him out of hospital.
Yes.
It comes as I'm sure anyone who's had experience with child mental health issues, it comes at a huge cost to everyone in the family because it's a very intense process.
How did your parents go about accessing, because I imagine when you've got a young person...
Well, there was only my mother. She was widowed at 38 with 5 kids. So, she did it tough. And she was, already sort of a bit off with the fairies, also inherited. Maddie was pretty seriously mad. He was often violent as well. But his experiences in hospitals were horrific.
Right.
Absolutely horrific. He was in Woolston Park. There was a lot of shock treatment still in those days. And the medication that he was on was incredibly heavy. I can't remember the names, but he would sometimes just be like a zombie. And schizophrenia is a very, very difficult one because they seem to disappear. The person that they were disappears. And he would get flashes. So the actual worst bits were when he was on a medication that was working, that was reducing his paranoid delusions, which would make him violent because he saw everybody against him. He would come to the realisation, oh my God, I have a very serious mental illness. I will never get married. I will never have a job. I will never have children. And that made him very, very suicidal. So, it was a very, very difficult time. And the hospitals and the psychiatrists would say, my mother would go in and they would say things like, your son will be in this facility for the rest of his life.
Yeah,
when he was 16.
Yeah. That lack of hope.
Yes.
Do you think...
He kept escaping.
Yeah.
He was a great escaper.
Well, I think it's also, we've come to the conversation. There's a great book for sale out there by a guy called Johan Hari, which has written a book called Lost Connections, which for me was one of the best books I'd read on anxiety and depression because it talked about that need for purpose and meaning, for simple social connections, about social prescribing, in a sense, of connecting people back into their community. It's not just about treatment and service, it's about being loved and being meaningful. And
there are fantastic programs running in countries like Finland where, I think we're all over-medicated and over-prescribed, and I was very, very grateful that I was able to escape any of that with my 12-year-old son. You don't want to mess with a brain that's just deflowered and regrowing. That's what happens at that age, which is why probably a lot of mental illness starts then. But in Finland, they have programs which is family therapy. They go in and they sit with the whole family, and the person, even somebody with schizophrenia, sits there and speaks their truth, which is not everybody else's truth, but the family, because we would always go, oh, Maddie, that's not right, that's not happening, and just negate his things. But their program is about just listening and hearing their stories.
Yeah.
And it is proving really, really effective.
It's a great treatment. I remember reading once, it was just a great quote by Carl Jung, and I really remembered it. Do you remember this one? It was like looking at that difference between a bit more Freudian psychiatry, which was about if someone thought they were on the moon. I'll be misquoting this for sure, because I'm famous for that. I'm famous for getting stuff like not quite right. But if with the whole thing, if someone's on the moon, you sit there going, "You're not on the moon. You're not on the moon. You're not. This is not the moon."
Yes.
And that the Jungian approach was more about to speak to him, you had to go to the moon.
Yeah.
To speak to him, which I think is just profound. I mean, that's what
Yes.
you're doing in your story,
Yeah,
isn't
I guess
it, Peter?
so.
You're sort of going to the moon to actually have that conversation, which is, there's a certain magic that you need to employ in having those conversations.
And I think what we're talking about now is just listening and the power of being heard for people suffering.
Yeah.
To be heard and to be understood and to be believed.
And for children,
Yes.
I mean, we're talking about children. And before we were talking about our children and talking about, and I'm sure you have that thing, there's a profound loss of childhood and a sadness about that, about how do you support a child into having a happy, holistic childhood when they're experiencing such unwellness? Like, how do you give that back? Can you?
I don't know. They've got their own path, and all you
Yeah.
can do is be there and listen.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I guess.
I think that's the greatest sadness for me, that my son really did. His childhood ended, and he never got that back. It's casualty of the illness. And the life that someone with florid anorexia lives is a very painful and torturous kind of life, because the entire environment becomes a danger to the sufferer. My son, and this is not uncommon in children with anorexia, thought that water would make him fat, or that sitting next to someone who was fat would make him fat. Or I remember one day in Brisbane where we went for treatment, we hopped into a lift in Myers to go down to the car park, and a kid got in with McDonald's French fries, and Richie was up the back of the lift with his hands around his neck, trying to choke himself because he thought he would get fat from the French fries. And nothing ever takes that away. It's all those. He was really, really sick for an entire year, and then probably recovering for, maybe 4 or 5 years after that.
And he's okay now?
You don't get those years back.
No.
He's good now. Yeah,
Okay.
thanks.
How's your daughter?
My daughter lives with, she's not in, I'd say it's one of those things we're saying when you have a young person, she's okay, she's 23, she's living in Melbourne, she still doesn't self-regulate that well, but she's learning how to. I was just saying she just found a psychologist herself without me doing it, that she decided she wanted to speak to, because usually I took charge of that, being a triangulator. So I think that's kind of really important. I used to find those conversations, like when you have that story, we guard these stories and we don't share them because of the confidentiality. I remember being stopped, and I think I've got to tell this story in my book, but it's my people would, they often, how often people in the street, they'll run into you and you'll have children the same age and you haven't seen them for ages, and pretty well they just want to show you how well their kids are doing. And I go, oh my God, how are you? I haven't seen you in ages. And you got to go, oh yeah, how's, whatever, I'm trying to remember their kid's name, how's, Jennifer. Oh, she's doing so well. Oh, look, you wouldn't believe it. Oh, it's so hard at the moment. She's not studying enough, but she's going out and she's doing like complaining or saying, oh, she's got this news. She's the school captain. Oh, but she's studying so hard, and going on, and then going, how's Zoe? And I used to go, oh, she's fine. And then one day I said, she's good. She hasn't wanted to kill herself this week. Oh, my God, I enjoyed saying that so much. That shut that woman right up. Because we have this thing, I think we just accept, I don't think we think enough about the experiences of others and how if we actually burst onto them, what impact that can have on silencing them.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know whether you've had that similar experience of...
Yes, but actually if you dig under the surface, that person that's the school captain is probably up all night and got severe anxiety
Probably.
and
I should have said
stressing
that to her
out
as well.
Yeah. Yeah. And the positive I think that comes out of the kids getting these problems so early is that they do learn the strategies early.
Yeah, to self-manage.
I'm really glad that my son now knows that when he's getting these obsessive compulsive thoughts to pull in all of those strategies that he learnt when he was 12. So that now when he's, almost 20, he's got that already, when most of us, it's not until we hit menopause or something, and it's like, oh, shit. And you don't have anything there. So, yeah.
I understand what you're saying, but I kind of resist the idea of that there are any positives to be had from an extreme form of mental illness. And in a way, writing the story was kind of like a salvage operation. It's like, here's the wreckage of our lives. What can I take out of it and make something new from it? But I don't think anyone in my family would... Actually, that's not true. Richie did once say that he's where he is today because of everything that's happened to him until now. So maybe he's got a more evolved way of looking at it.
But in a sense, though, as well, if we talk about family therapy too, where and I have this sense in my family, as much as I love my daughter and I adore her, her illness took our whole family hostage. We were hostages. And it runs the family. I mean, how do you negotiate that? How do you negotiate living a normative life for the other children or people in the life when you have someone who is so much at risk?
And siblings are often the unacknowledged victims in this sort of situation.
Yeah. I mean, how do you do that? Was that something that, is...
Well, we all lived with it.
We just got through.
But we were already in a very shitty place anyway.
Yeah.
And then Maddie's illness, Maddie and I were both very, very naughty as well. There was a lot of drugs and alcohol going on. And that's something I would like to say too, is that my brother, I think, may have only had what my son had, which was just, highly sensitive anxiety, which may have developed into OCD. But he and a lot of his mates started smoking a lot of dope when they were 12. And, I'm all for smoking dope, but not when you're 12.
I remember.
Not when you're 12. And it's really, really not cool to blow out.
Yeah.
There are all these studies that, for prepubescent children, if they do it with mice, they just completely lose it, the pre-adolescent mice. They just can't find their way to swim to the little floaty thing on the top. And it wasn't just my brother. My brother was just the first to go, but through his group of friends, I think 4 or 5 of them developed schizophrenia, and the one that didn't get schizophrenia is now a terrible, a homeless alcoholic. It severely, and they were all good boys. They were just mucking around. I don't think they were medicating at 12. I think they were just mucking around because a few of them had older brothers, and that's what happened. So yes, it's not cool to blow out young people.
When you said they're self-medicating, like, Peter, do you think that little kids, is there depression, do you think, that they're experiencing, does it present differently? We just assume from an adult perspective, and when we have to almost get inside, what does depression look like to a child? What messages are going on in that child about their life, and about their meaning?
Obviously, I was sort of just operating in a fictional world when I was making the story, but Yeah, not just the metaphor of the elephant, but for me one of the dangers was just being careful. We talked about shame before, but being careful of the idea of responsibility. And I guess the last thing you want, because I guess my story is a bit flipped where it's the child worrying about the parent. The last thing you want is for the child to feel responsible.
But children do.
Yeah, but
children
I'm,
very
I'm
often
sure they
carry
do take that on.
Yeah.
So that's a careful little dance that you have to dance. And not to... I mean, in this story, Olive, she wants to cheer up her father, but it's not a how-to guide. Like it's not. If you've got a father with depression, read this book. It's nothing like that.
I guess, but you know what? When you start out, I think you're looking for that, aren't you? You're just looking for the magic solution, and then one day you realise there isn't one. You have to navigate, in a sense, what's going to work.
But I think stories like yours, if a child is going through a terrible experience like that, they at least know that they're not alone. And that's what literature is for, is that connection and that reflection of our experience. So you go, oh yeah, I'm not the only one.
Yeah.
But I mean,
it reminded me a bit of, there was a film in the same, one of my favourite films, which is My Life as a Dog.
Oh, I love that movie too.
Which is you should look it up if you can. You probably can't find it in video shops anymore because they don't exist. But My Life as a Dog, I think was it
Online, you might find it online.
I can't even remember the filmmaker's name offhand, but...
Lasse Hallström.
Oh, thank you. I was going to say that. But that whole...
It's got to American-made horrible, like Mission Impossibles now.
Yeah, but it's really amazing because it is that thing of not patronising a child. It's a child going through the grief of the death of their mother, and this kind of almost magic fantasy that they develop as a means of self-soothing and to make sense of the world. Because for children, very often they are, aren't they? Their mental illness, like for Richie, he was trying to make sense of the world through his understanding of him and calories and, how to keep control. Is it often around this thing around children trying to find their control not in that way of like a doctor would say, but like within their illness even, trying to find the way up?
I don't know. I'm pretty careful to steer away from that whole concept of control because it's been so wrongly used in the past. And I think, looking back, I'd say the mental changes almost preceded the food changes, and that the whole... back in that particular year, there were a slew of articles in the paper about childhood obesity. And I can clearly remember the day Rich came to me and said, I feel depressed and I'm worried that I'm going to get obese because children who are depressed get fat. And so I think the mental changes that were already taking place kind of latched onto what was out there in the environment as much as anything.
So is the environment, in a sense, for young people who are so impressionable, as social media takes charge, as there's, you look at billboards, there's higher incidence of eating disorder in younger kids all the time. Is that messaging making our kids sick?
I think it's a contributing factor.
Yeah.
It's, it's pretty hard to deny that we're a society that's pretty obsessed with physical appearance, with weight, and that obsession has kind of filtered down to our children. But that's not the only thing. I mean, there are other factors too. And of course, a big one are genetic factors, which are now being identified as contributing to it. And, Rich always had a tendency to be very obsessive. It's pretty much a family tendency. So that it's not one particular gene, but it's not that's been identified so far, but a combination of genes that do predispose a child.
What would do you mind if I ask a question?
Of course you can. It's a conversation. You can ask the question.
What would you say would be a good idea for when children would show those very early signs that you just mentioned, when you first said he was feeling depressed, or because as we mentioned before, you don't want to dismiss it, but is there a danger in validating it too much when it's very early? Or
I don't
know.
think there is a danger in validating it. I think that was my mistake.
Okay.
To be fair, I was caring for my mother who was going through a long and painful death at the time. But again, what's wrong with me? I didn't like to think that my child, who was only 11, was depressed. I mean, that was sort of not okay. And
It also makes you feel a sense of failure too as a parent.
Totally.
Yes.
Yeah.
But looking back, no, I should have taken that really seriously. And who knows, things could have been very... And I think that comes down to the whole question about that Mandy said at the beginning about early intervention.
So what would you
So
advise?
important.
Yeah, if you could go back and
At
what would you do now?
what point?
Like knowing what you do now.
Well, there weren't a lot of things I could have done differently either at the time, because the treatment options were just woeful,
There's
as Mandy experienced in the same region. I would get a little bit more competent with the internet if I had my time again.
You do a lot of research, don't you, in the end?
Because now the information it's there online. You can find it. And if you can't get the right help in your area, you can buy books that help you to figure out what to do.
You kind of developed your own strategy, though, which I was really interested, which I kind of did as well.
Yeah.
Forced into that resourcefulness, you cherry pick
Absolutely.
from the big tree of therapy that there is not one place to go to. Well, I even ended up at a rainbow crystal healer, and I don't believe in that. I'm like, I don't care, I'll give everything a crack.
anything.
Surrounded by rose quartz, well, this could work. I hate to tell you it didn't work, but it worked for him, he got paid quite well. But from the cherry tree, isn't it? Because you came up with quite you took the strategy that you had was very extreme, but you made it with
Made
you.
it work.
Yeah.
We ended up at a place called Footprints of Angels, which some of you may have heard of. And the trouble there, of course, was Rich was one little boy angel amongst a sea of girl angels and a sea of pastel shades and little chintzy angels hanging on the wall. But it gave me a safe place to... I got together like a team, a GP who would monitor his physical signs to make sure he wasn't going to have a heart attack and die, and a psychiatrist who mainly supported me. It was a child psychiatrist, but Rich wouldn't have anything to do with him. I cobbled together a team, but I was heavily influenced by the reading I'd done about the family-based therapy, which is what's coming out of the University of Chicago and Stanford University in the US, evidence-based treatment, and the only evidence-based treatment for anorexia.
Yeah.
Which is basically refeed the child. Anorexia, the brain is starved, the child is no longer capable of rational thought. They're not able to make the right decisions for themselves about what they can eat, what's the right amount to eat. The parent has to take control of that until such time as the child is weight restored, and then there's often a lag before the mental function resumes properly again, and the control can gradually be handed back over.
Yeah, it is one of those, it is quite a difficult process in that getting towards, and was there a fear, and I guess it's also in that navigating your own way of I guess for where do people go, I guess is one question too, that was where I was stuck to find out where do I go? Do you go to your local GP? I went to my GP and they didn't know anything about anorexia. And then I had to research my own psychiatrists because they didn't really know this. They were referring me to child psychiatrists that they knew nothing about. And I'm like, you want to find a GP that has a relationship, I would think, with those other specialists and professionals and can recommend. I couldn't find, I had to go, I was just telling Amanda, I used to do auditions where I'd turn up and go, okay, I'm not bringing my daughter to see you until I've been through.
That's triangulating again.
Yeah, I triangulated all over there because you can't. It's because for children to keep articulating what's wrong with them tends to reinforce. Did you find that it reinforces?
Particularly when they think there's nothing wrong with them.
Yeah.
Which I'm in denial, hallmark of anorexia. So my son's like, there's nothing wrong with me. F you, mum. And literally, I mean, he turned from this 11-year-old child, had turned from being this amazing, intelligent, amiable, wanting to be involved in everything child to someone who would swear at me and kick me in the shins. And it was the illness that was making him do that.
I guess the question then is to talk about one of the biggest challenges with adults and with children, and children too because of their age, is insight. How do you deal when you're dealing with a young person, particularly who either through their age or through their illness doesn't have the insight to help them recover from their condition?
Yeah, well, with Matty, it was always, he was the sane one and we were the mad ones. And one day I remember I made the mistake of saying, Matty, you have schizophrenia. And that was like, I'm on the floor with my hands around the throat. It's like, oh God, I shouldn't have said that. But yes, but then when he was on medication and did realise that was actually the most painful thing.
Yeah.
And it's very, very painful for everybody around them to watch, because it's the word, I'd watched my father die a very painful death of cancer, and watching Matthew's battle and suffering was way worse, way worse. Yeah.
Yeah, that is.
Yeah.
It's hard. Yeah, it is that, that the heartbreak
And
of when
having
you
the
actually
insight
have.
was actually more painful.
Yeah, more
so,
yeah.
I don't know.
Exactly, it's a great.
Yeah.
Oh, and also one of the interesting, I was talking to a friend of mine the other day who's, she's an amazing story. She's the Deputy Commissioner for Mental Health in New South Wales. She was told by her psychiatrist, she's bipolar, schizoid bipolar, I'm not sure which way it goes. She was told by her psychiatrist that she would never work, ever, never. And she didn't actually get a first job till she was 40, and now she's Deputy Commissioner of Mental Health in New South Wales. Her name is Faye Jackson. I can tell that part of her story because she tells that in her keynote, otherwise I would not be disclosing that. She is the most brilliant speaker you'll almost ever see on advocating for people's story and about their role. And because she has a very serious enduring illness, and she talks about still the place that we have to go is that we've started to have the conversation and accept anxiety and depression, but we are still a long way away from really understanding and destigmatising the more enduring mental health conditions like schizophrenia.
People used to have just one episode of schizophrenia. I mean, there are different gradations of schizophrenia as well, and the earlier you get it, the worse it is in most cases. But they used to just have one episode and then get better. But yeah, anyway, there's a book called Anatomy of an Epidemic, which goes into a lot of science behind the medicalisation of everything and how the medicine can cause some of the chronic recurrence.
I do love in your book, actually, in Thrill Seeker, which is a fiction about these young guys, which I love because I just finished reading Tim Winton's The Shepherd's Heart.
Oh, I haven't read that.
Well, I actually thought you did a much better job of inhabiting a young man.
I'll take that one.
For you? I know. I actually felt, I don't know, I've never been a young man yet. The crystal therapist might tell me differently. But I felt like you really authentically inhabited that space of a young man and those voices and the brothers between Brian and Dougie.
We were very close.
I guess,
And I hung out with all those boys. I was hanging out with them all.
Yeah.
So, I just changed myself to a boy.
When you're writing that, though, do you step into that? Do you step into, like, is there part of you where, because you have to empathise to...
Yes, and for me that's the wonderful magic of fiction, and you can get into somebody else's shoes and somebody else's head, and it's the best tool for compassion because you're walking around as somebody else.
True.
You can time travel too.
Yeah. Yeah, writing is very powerful. So just to close the session today, because it's on, because we're talking about early intervention strategies, and none of us are health professionals. Well, you're a doctor, but you're not working as a doctor anymore.
No.
So we're here as, creative people and writers and parents and sisters and daughters of. So what does, to close with, what does early intervention, I guess, what do you think it looks like? What, you know, for a young person after your experience, knowing what you know now, what could early intervention look like for someone who was had a young person at risk?
I wouldn't be as qualified to answer, but I'll answer anyway. To me, it looks like strong relationships and connections, so that those people around, the parents, if it's the parents' responsibility, just having that strong foundation to begin with, and having somebody that listens to you, somebody that trusts you, that what you're going through is real. And I think that the thing that's easy to do as adults is we think that because we've all been children and we all got through it, then whatever the child's going through, they're just going to get through it because we all got through it. But those emotions that kids are feeling, that's their world. Everything's complete as real for them as it is for us. And they're the biggest feelings that they've ever felt. So I think it's important not to dismiss anything as just a moment of childhood that they'll get through, but just to trust them and believe them and listen to them.
Thanks, Peter. Edwina?
Yeah, I would go right with Peter. Yes.
As unqualified
it's
as
the listening, and I think that because my son and I had a very good, close relationship, he was able to come to me. Like he would. It started, I always had to check his school bag that all the zips were done up, like a lot of times. And then I started, I started talking to him. So the talking, it's very important. It would take me a lot of talking, a lot of time. It was exhausting. And I'm glad that I was a writer working part-time, so that I had that time. And I think that maybe that's what's happening is, anyway, devaluing of motherhood is another seminar for another day. But it's very, very, very important. It took a lot of time, hours every day, and then going to bed again, I'd sit with him at night time and do a guided relaxation and all of that stuff. And yeah, it's that putting that time. It's time and energy. Yeah.
Early intervention for me looks like a team approach, like assembling a team of health professionals that appropriate to whatever the illness is, and involving the parents. And I know this is an experience that Mandy's had from an earlier conversation we had, where all too often parents are excluded from the conversation when a child's mental health is at stake. And often I think there's an underlying assumption that the parents are to blame. And instead they should be used as a resource, because, as I said earlier, caring for someone with mental illness is very time consuming, and the health system just doesn't have the capacity to provide the one-on-one kind of care that a parent can for their child. And I know when Rich was sick, I wasn't allowed to know what his weight was. And when you consider the fact that I was the one feeding him, it makes no sense. So that's my thing, involve the parents.
I think too, if you have someone in your life, like a young person, or you have people with children, one of the things I really wanted that wasn't there was you need people to support you. You need people there to support your other children. You need someone, the old coming over with some dinner. Actually, you can't even say how much that supports to feel cared for by a community, so you can care for a young person. I think also understanding the intelligence and respecting the survival of that young person. I had, very quickly to close with one tiny story. My daughter was suicidal, had to go to the psychiatrist. It was the weekend, so he wasn't working. So I said, just go to it was an adolescent mental health unit. We go there, and the admissions officer says, it was very chaotic, and it takes us outside to a picnic bench. And my daughter's she was 17 at the time, I think, and the woman who's doing the admissions says, look, I don't know how to tell you this, but I don't think you should go in there at the moment because there's a lot of girls in there trying to hang themselves. And I went, okay. It's like, that's not what you want. We didn't say anything. I said, God, we're going to go. I get in the car and I said to my daughter, are you okay? And she turned around and she goes, yeah, they could have said they were fucking full. And I went, that was just the most awesome response. I truly knew I had this feeling like, wow, she's right in the middle of it, but she gets it.
Yes.
You know, she gets it.
And
So-
she's got a sense of humour.
Huge sense of humour. We had
probably
a
helps
huge
too.
laugh all the way home. Going, that's so funny. We can't tell anyone except you. But yeah, so do learn to connect and share your story. I think it's incredibly important, particularly with young people. And if you know anyone, do support them. I really encourage you to come over to the book signing tent and actually buy these books and follow these authors. It's really great writers and on really important, very important stories that you will love. So today, can you please join me in thanking Peter Carnavas, Amanda Webster and Edwina Shaw.
Thank you so much. And I'm going to add and please thank Mandy Nolan.
Oh yeah, thank you. And while you're at it,